Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is another live recording, this time in front of an audience of students from three schools in Oxford, Doverbrooks, Cheney School and Swan School, 16, 17 and 18-year-olds and a few of their teachers, but you'll hear the voices of the students in the questions at the end. In this episode, I'm talking to the historian of the United States, Adam Smith, about a question that often rears its head. Is America on the brink of another civil war? More specifically, does the original American Civil War give us any guide to the conflicts of the present? And if we're not looking at another civil war, what are we looking at? The subject of this discussion is another civil war question mark, partly because people do bandy around the idea of American Civil War. I sometimes feel as though they think it's the sort of thing that Americans do, because the phrase American Civil War trips off the tongue. And so there's a feeling they did one, they might do another one, rather than thinking, well, they did one, but there has only been one. And it was 160 years ago. You might say the English do civil war. We did one as well, even longer ago. We're going to talk about the original American Civil War, and then we're going to get on to talking about the politics of now. But this is partly to think about the past and the present alongside each other. And I wanted to start, Adam, by asking you whether there are, leaving aside the 160 years difference, themes that connect the politics of the United States in the 1850s and 1860s to now. There are so many differences, and we'll come on to some of those. But one in particular is the fact that it is a country that still exists, broadly speaking, under the same constitution. And that constitution did play a part in the original Civil War. And I don't know whether we can say that there are fault lines in that constitutional arrangement, which mean that though it's only happened once, this is a state that might be prone to civil breakdown. Do you think there is constitutional continuity there that makes this talk of then and now meaningful?
One of the things that's so interesting is that in one sense, the United States is an incredibly old country, even while continually conceptualizing itself as a new future-orientated country. There's no other country in the world that I can think of where politics refers back to the views of 18th century politicians. We're not typically interested in the views of William Pitt or even of William Gladstone or Benjamin Disraeli 70 years later when we're talking about social and political issues. But in the United States, because of the Constitution, because of the constitutive role of the Supreme Court as it has emerged over the last 200-odd years, there are all kinds of ways of thinking about the United States as the same kind of entity constitutionally now that it was even before the American Civil War. But it is also true that although the American Constitution is still broadly the same, there was a constitutional revolution after the Civil War and because of the Civil War. And it was such a foundational constitutional revolution, or at least potentially it was, that you could, if the United States had been France, which they very pointedly weren't, and made a point of kept on telling themselves and each other that they weren't France, they would have called it the Second Republic. So the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution passed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War because of the Civil War fundamentally changed the relationship. Well, it created American citizenship in a formalized way for the first time and changed the relationship between American citizens and the federal government. And so the other way of looking at it is that one reason why it's hard now to imagine a civil war in the United States that resembles the kind of civil war that happened in the 1860s is because that civil war ended in the way that it did. Lots and lots of things were left unresolved by the American Civil War. But one thing that was almost completely buried was the legitimacy of secession. Although there are even now little secessionist movements in Texas and California, and perhaps even people dreaming about New England secession in the wake of the last presidential election. These are incredibly marginal movements. That's actually quite a striking thing. Other countries, obviously including our own, have much, much more powerful secessionist movements, far more stronger reasons to believe they will structurally disassemble themselves than is true of the United States. And that's largely because of the experience of the 1860s.
What about states' rights and the power of the federal government? So in a way, the Civil War was made possible because that was unsettled. The Civil War settles it in some respects. It also settles some things about the power of the presidency, which again, relatively, you might say, was unsettled before the war. On the one hand, because it's settled, that might make a future war less likely. On the other hand, some of the ways in which it was settled was the beginning of the assertion of the power of the presidency and federal government, which is, as we'll come on to, one of the fault lines in American politics today. So where would you say the state-federal government relationship stands relative to what happened then?
So, I mean, this is a terrifically interesting question. And any conversation about the United States, past, present, or future, has to start from a recognition of its federal structure, which is, of course, a constantly contested, constantly evolving relationship between the states and the federal government, but also between internal entities like cities within states and state governments. As you say, David, the Civil War was only possible. It was only possible. Why was there a big war over slavery in the United States, and there wasn't a war in the British Empire or in Brazil or in the French Empire or in any other places where slavery ended in the 19th century? The really short answer to that is because the slave-holding states in the United States already were running their own governments. They had no reason to concede, like the slaveholders in the British Caribbean were essentially forced to concede and to do a deal in Westminster. Congress, the president, the Supreme Court had no authority over the status of slavery within the states. And the state governments, the transition from a state like South Carolina being part of the Union to being outside of the Union, was one that, in terms of the operations of government, was the easiest thing in the world in the 1860s. How far is that different now? Well, it's fundamentally different now in most respects. And that's not a transition, I would say, that happened immediately after the Civil War, though the Civil War was an essential precondition. It's a function of the 20th century, the growth of the bureaucratic administrative state, especially since the 1930s. And it's impossible now, I think, to disaggregate. Those states have huge amounts of autonomy. It's impossible to really disaggregate state power and federal power in the way that it was possible to do in the 19th century. So the process of state secession, even if we can imagine a scenario in which there were political movements that pushed secession and even gained ascendancy in some place or other, and I think we're a long, long, long way away from that. But even if that happened, the process of disentangling a state from the federal government would be immensely complex now in a way that it actually wasn't, frankly, in 1861.
And including not just structurally, but fiscally complex
Absolutely.
as well.
Indeed, yes. And I mean, in much the ways that disentangling Scotland from the United Kingdom will be extraordinarily difficult. Yes.
One more question about the parallels, and then I want to get on to the differences and bring us more up to date. This is a constitution that includes the right to bear arms. And this is a country in its long history that has a tradition of having armed citizens and indeed armed militias back then and now. One of the preconditions of there being a civil war anywhere is the government can't be the only people who hold the guns. When the government holds the guns, you won't get a civil war. Is there enough continuity from 19th century America to 21st century America in relation to gun ownership and the lack of a monopoly of the means of violence relative to, say, European states, that means we can see even the glimmer of a connection?
Well, of course, the United States is a massive outlier in terms of gun ownership and consequently gun violence in the Western world. And the constitutional provision that you refer to is a large part of that. But of course, it's not the whole story, because there are lots of ways in which the Constitution and constitutional amendments can be reinterpreted in other ways. I mean, it's by no means the whole story. It's not a straightforward matter that because it's in the Constitution, nothing can be done, because things have been done in the past, things have been done at state level. But it's certainly true that the United States is, of course, a gun-owning society now. Not evenly so, of course, much more so in some parts of the country and outside of cities,
Republicans have
but
more
still
guns.
Republicans have, but it's much more of a gun-owning society than obviously the United Kingdom is in any equivalent society. But one thing that is different now, fundamentally different now than it was in the 1850s, is when the Civil War broke out in 1861, the United States Army was a tiny, almost irrelevant. It was tiny numbers of people posted in the West protecting settlers from indigenous people. The state militias were actually where all the action was. There was another reason why it was so easy for seceding southern states in 1860-61. The state apparatus was all there, including the military apparatus. They had state arsenals, Virginia Military Institute, for example. They had these training academies. All of that capacity was there at the state level. Now, of course, there are millions of citizens in arms, but the federal government has the serious military capacity up to and including nuclear weapons. And that means that it would be a very uneven fight unless there's some kind of disaggregation of the United States military or some kind of series of stages of disintegration which we haven't yet kind of imagined.
And I think it's true to say there is a lot of violence in the United States, less than in the 19th century, but
Yes,
still a
much
lot,
less, yeah.
much less. And like everywhere else, violence has been declining, but it tends to be violence of two kinds: citizen on citizen violence or state on citizen violence. The state commits a lot of acts of violence against citizens. There's very little citizen on state violence. And in a way, for that, you do need militias, you do need organized forms of weaponry and control. And that's the thing that is absent relative to the 19th century.
Yes, or at least insofar as there are, of course, militias, and there have been people prepping for the end of the world in the mountains of Montana or whatever for decades. There are people preparing for exactly this kind of scenario, but that's going to be a very, very uneven fight.
And even January the 6th, which was shocking in many ways, and it was a violent event, but relative to the kind of violence that you would associate with civic breakdown, it wasn't.
That's right. I mean, and that's part of the reason why it's been possible for the MAGA movement to dismiss it.
One of the features of the original Civil War was that it was a war in a state that was not constitutionally fully formed, in the sense that you say there's a second republic that comes after it, but also not geographically settled. And actually, it was the geographical question that was the immediate trigger. There was a civil war effectively in the 1950s in Kansas. I mean, the violence was very widespread already. And that feels fundamentally disanalogous to now. Once the continental United States is settled as a geographical entity, it's not clear what the issue would be that we could draw a comparison from then to now. So I want to ask you about where you think the fault lines lie in contemporary American politics. But relative to what was the trigger for the war in the 1860s, which was the question of how this nation was going to expand westward, free or slave. Is there anything analogous to that now? I mean, I was thinking about Trump invading Greenland as a trigger for a civil war. It doesn't work. Greenland, free or slave, it doesn't work. I don't even know what that means.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right in your characterization of the origins of the American Civil War. Without the United States was a nation in the 19th century and really up until, well, really towards the very end of the 19th century, the United States was a nation without fixed borders. And it had also, this is another constitutional point which is worth re-emphasizing, the incredible thing about, in many ways, the most incredible thing about the American Constitution, although this is a highly debatable point, is that it created, the original 13 states created the means of their own replication. That's an incredible thing, right? So 13 states have now become 50 states, with those additional states having the same level of representation and political equality as the original 13. Why would you do that? Like, nobody else did that, right? I mean, at the time of the American Revolution, Virginia laid claim to great swathes of land, and Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts in the West. They ceded that land to the federal government on the understanding that new states would be created. So it's not just that the borders of the United States were unstable and constantly evolving in the 19th century. It was that new political entities were constantly being created out of that expanding space. And so then, as you say, then that meant that every time there was territorial expansion, because of this political, economic, moral crisis over slavery, a division, the United States divided, as Lincoln said, half slave and half free, that it became a critical question each time there was an issue of accepting or creating a new territory and then a new state. And nothing like that exists today. That is a 19th century story that I can't think of a contemporary parallel.
So the other trigger for the war was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. And here we can possibly see parallels. So there are all of these differences. And I want to get on later to the question of whether it's really plausible in 2026 to see whatever civic breakdown might happen spilling over into the levels of violence that we would call a civil war. But if we just think about the question of civic breakdown, loss of legitimacy of the state, the breakdown of relationships between the federal government and lesser political entities, it is not hard to imagine a presidential election. Indeed, I mentioned January the 6th, we've had them, and the next one may be another, in which a significant portion of the American public and possibly a significant number of states, conceivably, contest the results of the election or reject its legitimacy. And in some ways, it's surprising it hasn't happened more extensively already. There was talk about the resistance in 2016, but it didn't amount to much. Donald Trump tried to refuse to acknowledge the result in 2020, but it didn't amount to much. There was one shocking event, but it didn't amount to much. He came back 2024, 2025, and again, there's been surprisingly little resistance to the legitimacy of his presidency. So I hesitate to say the next one is going to be the one when it happens. But should we at least think that is within the bounds of our politics, of
Yes.
their politics today?
Yes, but I think we need to separate out two slightly different or sometimes overlapping things. So one is, does everybody accept the legitimacy of an election, which is a pretty foundational thing to a healthy democracy? Clearly, that is majorly in question in the United States right now. We don't even need to wait to the next presidential election. I think it's reasonable. We can easily imagine that if the Democrats do as well as we expect them to do in the midterm elections, it's hard to imagine Donald Trump responding to that as Obama responded to the Democrats losing control of Congress when he was 2 years into his first term. Trump will surely, unless he has some great personality transformation between now and November, will respond to that by questioning the legitimacy of that election. So that's one type of crisis. Actually, what happened in 1860 is slightly different because the southern states that seceded didn't question the legitimacy of Lincoln's election. They weren't saying this was a rigged election.
No, he won.
He won.
That was the bad
and
news.
That was the problem. That was the problem. Now, he won, it should be said, on only 40% of the popular vote. And the problem in 1860, for which there is no exact analogy, although we can we squint, we can try to see it, there's no exact analogy today, is that the Electoral College in 1860 enabled Lincoln to win overwhelmingly in the Electoral College for president. Nobody contested that victory. But because he swept all of the free states of the North, even while he won virtually no votes at all, virtually no support at all in any of the southern states. And the position of the southern states in 1860 was that it was an existential threat to their political economy, to their way of life, to their masculinity, to their way of being, to their sense of themselves as Americans, to have somebody elected as the president who did not accept the legitimacy of property in human beings. That was so unacceptable. And by the way, I think they were probably correct to think that, right? And they also saw the election of 1860 as being, if we can't win under this system in 1860, we'll never win. A famous writer in Boston said the real cause of the American Civil War is not the election, but the census of 1860, which is getting at that underlying reality. So we don't quite have that kind of situation today, even while we actually have a bigger problem in some ways with people calling into question the legitimacy of the democratic process.
But it does touch on that question, which is a feature not just of American politics, which is the anxiety that people feel in democratic societies about what's sometimes called losers' consent. The traditional idea of democratic politics is you didn't win this time, but you will get another chance. And in that case, that wasn't a plausible argument. Yes. Don't worry, you lost in 1860, you'll win in 1864. Well, no, they wouldn't, and they weren't going to win at any point in the future. So now, I don't think it's broken down for that reason, in the sense that people look at the system and just think the Republicans or the Democrats are going to win every time because the demographics are pointing that way. It's more that they think 4 years is too long to be patient and the good guys and wait for your turn. Politics has become so seemingly existentially fraught in different ways that the thought maybe in 2028, and there was a bit of it in 2024, but in 2028, you're meant to suck it up again, say the Republicans win again, and let them have another 4 years.
There is also that level of anxiety that somehow the system will be rigged, and so you won't ever get a fair election again. You hear that and see that
Yeah,
a lot on
and as
election.
you say, if the Democrats do well in the midterms, Trump is not going to say, "Well done, I accept it." But if the Republicans do well in the midterms, against all the odds, the Democrats are not going to say that was a fair election. They're going to say it was rigged,
Yeah.
not ballot stuffing rigged, but rigged by the restrictions that are placed on Democrats supporting voters. So you said if you squint at it, you can see parallels. I don't want to get you to speculate. Well, I do want to get you to speculate about what might happen next time. But are there scenarios, and we're not talking here about secession, and we're not talking here about armies pre-existing ready to go. None of that holds. But the breakdown of the legitimacy of the electoral system, do you think that is a realistic possibility?
So here, I think we get to where there are genuine and disturbing parallels between American politics today and American politics in the run-up to the Civil War in the 1850s. So what they have in common is as follows. So there are essentially to make a complicated story simple, there are essentially two camps who fundamentally believe, and not wholly without reason, that if the other side wins, it's game over. The stakes could not be higher. And furthermore, they're getting higher every single time. And these two sides, furthermore, are living in their own information silos. They're consuming news and information that merely reinforces their own preconceptions.
And just to be clear, that was true in the
That was
1850s.
absolutely true in the 1850s, where there was a highly partisan press, where nobody was reading the newspapers of the other party, where there was an extraordinary kind of ratcheting up of kind of fear-mongering, scaremongering about the other side, some of it based on reality, some of it entirely invented. A geographical sorting so that you just don't know. You don't have people in your family, your friend group, in your community, in your workplace who support the other side, which obviously further kind of reinforces this separation. And what the political science terms is affective polarization. So effectively how much you hate the other side. And that was definitely true in the 1850s. Effigies being burned of the other side in the streets, elections being ramped up to this sense that the other side was fundamentally out to get you, which entirely seems to be what's playing out in the United States today. I mean, there's lots of surveys, surveys, for example, showing the only last remaining widespread acceptable prejudice is partisanship. So, this is maybe less true now than it was 2 years ago, but people in surveys say if your son or daughter brought home someone from dated someone from a different race, would that be okay? People now feel they have to say that would be okay, whether or not that's entirely true. Would you be okay if they dated someone from a different religion? 30, 40 years ago, Catholics and Protestants. But what people are very happy to say is that they would be extremely upset if their Democratic daughter dated a Republican guy or whatever. And that's visceral. That's really visceral. And that, as a historian of the 19th century, is very reminiscent of the materials that I've spent years reading through from the Civil War era.
It's visceral. Do you think it could be structured in a way that produced a kind of civic breakdown? Not a civil war, but a civic breakdown. So one of the possible differences here, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, is then it was very structured around states. And it's not so clear it is now. People talk about red states and blue states, but there are other divides too. And a lot of it is around cities, and it's urban, rural, but also sanctuary cities, cities as sites of resistance. It's not completely clear, if this were to break down, exactly how the fault lines would cash out. So we think of it as partisan because it's party-based. But if you want to think about where it would structure itself in a society, it's not so say after the next election, it breaks down. How do the cards fall?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of work on this. That people in the United States overwhelmingly live in communities of one party or another, far more so than is the case in this country. But as you say, that's not a state by state thing. That's really about population density. So basically, the closer you are to the middle of a big city, the more likely you are to be a Democrat and to be surrounded by Democrats. But if you go out of the city in any state, if you travel, if you drive out into rural Vermont or western Massachusetts, you see Trump signs everywhere. Even in really liberal states, it's really easy to go to places, rural places, where you can be absolutely certain that everyone you meet are likely to be Trump supporters. So there is definitely a geographical split, but it's a much more complicated one, and one that obviously doesn't easily lend itself to the kind of 1861 Civil War split.
And the joke that was always told, which is Texas will secede from the Union and then Austin will secede from Texas.
Yeah,
And then maybe there's a bit of
yeah,
Austin that will secede
yeah,
from Austin.
yeah.
You can see a version of this where it just doesn't play out in a way where you get two armies
No,
lined up against each other.
no. But what you can imagine, though, is all kinds of levels of political resistance short of civil war. And so, one of the reasons why, I mean, I said earlier that I think federalism is, you have to center federalism into any discussion of American politics. We are already seeing now ways in which blue state governors, most prominently probably Gavin Newsom in California, are at least posturing, at least rhetorically posturing about using state power to counter or to mitigate what the federal government is doing, in much the way that historically through the 20th century, with a by and large liberal, mostly Democrat controlled Washington, in much the same way that southern states used federal power to mitigate and try to counter federal power. And so you can imagine that escalating very easily if there's another Republican victory in the next presidential election. It's easy to imagine events, scenarios in which this is, after all, a very unusual situation because historically, the richest states have been the ones most committed to the federal system. That's really weird, right? I mean, usually it's the richest parts of a confederated polity are the ones with the most interest in pulling away. California, possibly in alliance with Washington and Oregon, could function in principle if it could be agreed and they could sort out the military issues and the fiscal issues and all these kinds of things, in principle could function quite well. And short of secession, which, as we've said or we agree is very unlikely, they can certainly do all kinds of things to take more power back to the state level, refuse to remit funds, block the operation of the IRS, block federal operations at the state level. There are lots of tools potentially available that have never been used. There's toolboxes rusty and locked up that have never been taken down by Democratic governors, but are waiting there and that were used once before by Southern governors, which they could crack open again.
The fact that Gavin Newsom is in some ways the symbol of this resistance, and Gavin Newsom is also potentially the next president of the United States. Again, that suggests two possible scenarios, one of which is he's seen it from both sides, and this is how you end up getting something that's stable, which is, I mean, after all, he can't entirely put all his eggs in that basket if he also hopes to govern at the federal level. The other way of looking at it is Republican governors are going to take one look at this guy and how he behaved under Trump, and they're going to take it to the next level on day one. And that second scenario, I have to say, seems in our politics, the politics of 2026, the more likely one.
Yes, I agree. I agree entirely. I think you'll see it either way. I think if there is a Democratic victory next time round, then I'm sure that's what Republican states will do. But I think it will also be true that if J.D. Vance becomes president or Marco Rubio or Tucker Carlson, we will see
Or Donald Trump
or
Jr.
Donald Trump Jr. or
Don't
anybody else.
don't
We
joke.
will for sure, I would imagine, see attempts to nullify federal legislation at state level and from blue states. I agree. I think we'll see it in both directions.
So it is tempting, as I said at the beginning, because there was an American Civil War. It was a long time ago, but there are interesting parallels, and you've drawn them out. To think this is the question. It's a question about legitimacy, elections, about the absence of losers' consent, about the ways in which the state versus federal tensions play out. But it's also possible that thinking like that is to be worrying about the wrong thing. And actually, the risks in American politics in 2026 are not ones for which there is a 19th century historical parallel. Because of the size, the scope, the scale of the American government, because of the ways America is being governed at the moment by a president who is, whatever else you think of him, a gambler and is reckless, that the risks are not of civic breakdown, but so much as government breakdown. So, for instance, if through some act of brinkmanship or folly or neglect, the United States reneges on its debt, or there is a run on the dollar and the dollar ceases to be the global reserve currency. If the next pandemic finds the American government even less well equipped to handle it than the most recent one, if the hollowing out of the institutions of the bureaucratic administrative state do leave the United States vulnerable in ways that no one is thinking about at the moment, there isn't a 19th century parallel for that because there was no such state. But we live in a world in which our dependency on functioning bureaucratic and administrative institutions is almost total. And America is being governed by a president and a party that seems not indifferent to that, but strikingly reckless about the risks. So, is it possible that actually, if we're thinking about what might lead to a breakdown of America's politics, actually it's not the Civil War scenario we should be worrying about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would even go slightly further than you, David. I mean, you say they're indifferent to reckless about it. I think the Trump administration has made a conscious choice to know less. Federal government knows less and can do less now than it did under Joe Biden. They've removed so much expertise from the civil service. Data is not being collected that was being collected before. Just basic information is not available. I'm definitely not an expert in national security, but from the reporting, we can clearly see evidence of the consequences of the hollowing out of the State Department and the national security expertise, and specifically in this context, the Middle East expertise. We can see that playing out now, according to the reporting in the last few days. And that is replicated across all federal agencies. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that's quite deliberate. And I agree with you that is, given the, as you say, the dependency that we all now have in our different societies, that's extremely risky situation for Americans. And of course, with all kinds of global implications. And defaulting on the debt, as you mentioned, is probably up there among the most dramatic scenarios that we all need to worry about. I do still think, without harping on this subject, that I do think the existence of state governments gives a tiny measure of reassurance. And you imagine a scenario, it's not so difficult to imagine, of a Trump-like government in the UK hollowing out Whitehall. That's actually a scarier prospect, I would argue, for UK citizens than the Trump administration hollowing out the federal government in Washington is for American citizens, because there's no buffers. There's no, unless you happen to be in Scotland, perhaps, or Wales.
And we did see that during
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, the pandemic did remind people that governors of states have real powers, which is not true in the UK case.
And data gathering capacity, and also judicial. I mean, the court systems, the state court systems and state constitutions contain positive rights. And we're seeing now liberal lawyers working through the state system, appealing to state constitutions in order to safeguard the rights of threatened minorities, when previously, just a few years ago, they would almost never thought about doing that, because the whole focus was on building up the federal government, on accomplishing liberal objectives through the federal judiciary. So that the states do provide this very kind of, I think, very important counterbalance. Not an even one. It's also easy to go there and exaggerate it. It's not an even one. It's not going to save American democracy, but it is a mitigating factor, I think.
So as you said, in 1860, 1861, in a way, for the southern states, there was a structure in place so that for them to withdraw from the Union, it wasn't a big step for them. And it feels like now it's completely different in the sense that everything is so intertangled, that's a word, entangled, intertwined. Everything is so complicated. It's not as if Minnesota steps out of the Union and everything falls into place. But there is a force at work in the world in 2026, which isn't, I think, comparable to the southern states, but there are institutions which are in a way waiting to take over some of the functions of the American government if it fails, and they are the companies of Silicon Valley. So the United States is also a nation which is right at the cutting edge of the technology that also controls many of our lives. And there is, I don't know if it's an ideology, but there's an outlook in Silicon Valley that government itself is a relic of an analog world. And actually, what we are moving towards is when the next crisis happens, the institutions that are going to be there to pick up the pieces are not the governors of the states, not local institutions, but the infrastructure on which the entire government depends. And that, again, I don't know how that scenario plays out. It doesn't seem to me to lead to civil war, but government failure of one kind or another in the United States in the 21st century has in the background the possibility of private, corporate replications of government functions. They will provide you with the kinds of services that you
Yeah.
need. And that makes the 19th century seem like a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to our tech bro overlords. There was a big issue especially in the late 19th century, about the capacity of state governments to resist big corporations. And I suppose if you lived in a Midwestern town that was where you're dependent on the railroad, and the railroad company also owned your water supply, and you was your local electricity provider by 1910,
And ran
and
the
was
village,
complete and
the
ran
town store.
exactly. I mean, you may have actually had a similar kind of argument about how, however I vote here, they own our politicians, everything is in. And maybe we will see some kind of resurgence of that anti-corporate populism, which was, modestly successful, in some ways quite triumphantly so, in the first half of the 20th century. If you look hard, you could see the rhetoric is certainly there on the right as well as on the left. What we don't have is the infrastructure. The United States doesn't have the labor unions. It doesn't have the fraternal societies. It's harder to see how people have the organizational capacity now. The political parties, partisanship is dramatic and solid, but the parties as institutions, as structures, have been hollowed out. You're starting from a position now where the Silicon Valley tech bros are in a very, very powerful starting position. But there are plenty of traditions, democratic, populist traditions, that people can draw on to try to resist the scenario you're talking about.
I would say the difference between a world of the railroad company or Standard Oil controlling your lived space is that so many of those traditions themselves now exist online, in the sense that there are all sorts of ways in which citizens can organize themselves, can form their own communities in which they can give each other mutual support. But it's very hard to imagine that happening in a physical face-to-face way.
Yeah.
It's going to happen on the platforms of the people who I think are waiting for the government to fail so they can step in. So there is a future in which it is a bit 19th century, but it's 19th century on the platforms of the tech bro overlords. On that cheery note, we always like to end on a positive thought.
Hi, my question is, how much do you think the Supreme Court can act as a safeguard? Because, of course, in 2020, when Trump tried to dispute the election results, 3 of his own appointees did deny him. But in the light of ever-increasing hyperpartisanship, do you think that, let's say in 2028, they could actually side with him?
On a matter of foreign policy, obviously America now is a lot more relevant in the world. So how would other major countries respond to a possible civic collapse of the United States?
I mean, the Supreme Court, I just don't know, is the simple answer. There are reasons to believe that the Supreme Court will hold some kind of a line. I mean, I think, Trump, the administration is losing again and again and again in the courts. I mean, the trouble is, usually by the time they've lost, a lot of the damage has already been done. So, once you're relying on a judicial backstop in a way, the game is half lost anyway. We didn't get into a discussion about this, but I mean, the American Constitution, one of the problems here is the American Constitution is, in my view, disastrous in many ways and always has been, and is completely unreformable at the moment. And there have been moments in American history when there's been real constitutional creativity and there's been the possibility of reform. that seems impossible now because the partisanship is so even, because the polarization is a 50-50 polarization. It's not, as it was for most of the 20th century, a kind of 60-40 split or whatever. And so that makes it very difficult to imagine any constitutional change. But among the top of the things you would want to do, what I would want to do, among the many things I would want to do, would be to reform the Supreme Court. Until that happens, we're kind of held, the Americans are going to be held hostage in every election to Supreme Court nominations. And, that was one of the things that Trump spotted when he first ran in 2016, was the importance of selling to the Republican electorate, the importance of making Supreme Court nominations that would overturn Roe v. Wade, which, of course, was exactly what happened. And we're never going to escape that at the moment, right? And clearly there's a majority on the Supreme Court now that is inclined to take a conservative line in almost every situation. I don't see that change. Well, that isn't going to change.
And it does feel like a vicious circle in the sense that the dysfunctionality of the Constitution drives the partisanship, and the partisanship makes reform of the Constitution impossible. And if it is a vicious circle, it is going to get worse. I mean, whether it leads all the way to the scenarios we've been talking about, but this is not the worst of it yet.
No. The only way, how has the United States got out of crises in the past? One way you can get out of this kind of, some people call this a cold civil war, right? That would be another answer to your original question. How do you get out of a cold civil war? There's only two ways I can think of. One is that somehow the issue agenda changes and people forget what they were fighting about and move on to something else. The other is that one side wins and crushes the other. And maybe that will happen, right? Maybe that will happen. There have been moments in the last 15 years. Remember Karl Rove, the great Svengali, as he would like to think of himself, of George W. Bush? He thought the Republicans were going to establish themselves as a new majority party. After Obama won in 2008, there was excitable talk about him as the new FDR. It seems extraordinary now, but maybe one day it will happen. History would suggest it probably will. And in that scenario, then you might be able to break some of these log jams, including questions like reforming the Supreme Court.
And then on the international, how would the world react? I think there are different kinds of scenarios. So the one that we touched on, say the United States defaults on its debt and triggers a global financial crisis. The world would react in the ways that you would imagine, in that each nation would look to its own difficulties. There would be frustration, horror, outrage, but it would be a sort of rerun in a way of 2007, 2008. I think the United States doing things, and maybe we are in this scenario this week, doing things in the international arena that seem to go beyond the bounds of what the rest of the world, the rest of the United States supporting world, thinks is acceptable, is much harder one to judge. We haven't talked about what's happening at the moment, but the recklessness of this administration, some of it is a recklessness of hollowing out institutions on which America will depend in certain kinds of crises. But the other kind of recklessness is the lawlessness of its foreign policy. And I think we don't, I genuinely think we don't know from one week to the next how it's going to impact, how it's going to make nations that would traditionally support the United States feel. In a month's time, we could be in a somewhat different world.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Would it mirrors the collapse of the USSR with other powers, maybe China, maybe Russia, kind of stepping up as, setting a new world order completely without America at all?
I think the one thing it's not going to do is mirror the collapse of the USSR, because history doesn't work like that. And the United States remains, as of today, the richest and most powerful nation that the world has ever seen, which was not true of the USSR when it collapsed. And the USSR collapse was a very long, slow burn collapse. It was a society that had been hollowed out. So I don't think it would be analogous, but we may be talking about American Civil War as though or the possibility of American civil breakdown as though it was something that would fundamentally shape the world. Even that might not be the main story. There are other things that may be happening. What would Chinese civil breakdown look like?
There is a danger. We've set this up as a conversation about, is America going to have another civil war? There is, of course, a scenario in which, well, we've pretty much answered that question as being no anyway, even if we're acknowledging all kinds of other forms of civil breakdown and we're implying levels of continuing political violence and political dysfunction. But nevertheless, what David says, I cannot agree with you enough. At the end of the day, the United States remains the world's most powerful country by almost any metric right now. And I think maybe the metric in which it doesn't is in terms of tech superiority, where it seems that China is racing ahead, and that's obviously an very important story. But, the United States is not going anywhere fast. I mean, if I were to make one reasonably confident prediction, is that for the lifetime of everybody in this room, most of your lives much longer than mine, the United States is going to remain an extremely dominant and important power. It's not just going to disappear and collapse like the Soviet Union did. I can't really envisage a scenario in which that happens.
And we've been speculating about its possible collapse. If you think of three super powerful institutions or entities in the world at the moment, the American state, the Chinese state, and the tech industry, and you want to think which of these is most at risk of some kind of implosion in the next 30 or 40 years, it's easy to focus on the United States because all the noise is there, all the coverage is there. There isn't the same kind of coverage of what's going on inside Anthropic and OpenAI as there is what's going on inside the Trump administration. There isn't the same kind of coverage of what's going on inside the Chinese Politburo. I would say it is a completely open question which of those three is going to have its big crisis first. It could be a crisis of the technology. The technology could implode. It might not work. AI might not work, and we might plug into it and it fails. The Chinese system is not any more stable than the American system. So we shouldn't also just think that because we spend 80% of our time, I play a game each morning, which is I just count the number of headlines in the New York Times that include the word Trump. And I think they should do it too, because it's insane. It's sort of 18 of the top 25, right? Trump is not 18 of the top 25 most important things happening in the world at the moment. And he's also not 18 of the top 25 risks either.
So you touched upon how you think there's a possibility of a governmental breakdown in the USA rather than a civil war. And for the sake of us studying British government and parliament, how do you think potential breakdown of UK government in the future would differ from that of a USA governmental breakdown?
Looking back at the American Civil War, do you think you'd attribute it more between the rising tension between North and South or the trigger that was Lincoln's election?
On the first one, which is a good question. So I think one of the things that really matters in all of these things is if we're talking about the breakdown of consent in response to elections, electoral systems really matter. So the fault line in the American system is the Electoral College. The fault line in our politics now is simply our first past the post Westminster system. We're 2029 probably our next election, but say 2028, 2029, who knows what will happen in the United States, but it's sort of more predictable what's going to happen here in the sense that it looks like a system that's designed to create two-party dominance is going to be split 6 or 7 ways. And it's quite likely that no party will win a parliamentary majority, and it'll be very, very hard to create a stable government. In fact, it might be impossible to create a stable government. You can play around with the numbers, but just take 200 Reform MPs, 100 Green MPs, 100 Labour MPs, 100 Conservative MPs, 100 Lib Dem MPs, 50 SNP MPs, 20 Plaid Cymru MPs, and this is not going to add up right, 30 independents, and form a government out of that. You can't do it. So what happens then? Again, you could reform the system, but the incentives to reform the system when everybody hates everybody are difficult. Or you have another election. And you have another election in which at least 2 of the parties, I think the Greens and Reform, say, we told you the system doesn't work, it's designed to... And in the end, actually, what you might end up is with a majority government of one of the anti-system parties. That's one way it could go, but it's different from the American case because the electoral system, though we're both first past the post countries, is so different. None of those scenarios result in civil war. I think if we can't form a government after the next election, most people's lives will carry on as before. And the famous example in Belgium, for 18 months, they couldn't form a government and the economy grew faster than it had done in the previous decade. So, maybe we'll all be better off.
And life will carry on because there's a functioning civil service. So long as that's true. But it's a difficult question to answer in a sentence about the Civil War. I mean, there was a long-running, deeply entrenched conflict over slavery. But as you say, the trigger, and as we discussed in the conversation, the election of Lincoln was the thing that brought it to a head. If that hadn't happened, if Lincoln hadn't won in 1860, if the Republicans won in 1856, there probably would have been something like an American Civil War breaking out in 1857. If Lincoln hadn't won in 1860, but a Republican had won in 1864, then the war would probably have happened then. I think it was a situation in which by around about 1855, if not earlier, it was difficult to see how the political crisis in the 19th century United States was going to be resolved without some kind of breakdown of the sort that happened.
And that is not true now. So the scenarios we've been speculating about don't feel like they're baked in that way.
You just spent a moment talking about voting systems, but I was just going to ask to what extent you thought the two-party system in America is contributing to the partisanship, and if the sort of reform of the voting system to allow more multi-party democracy might be the most effective way to prevent situations like this in the future.
It's foundational, that, right? And in some ways, it is genuinely hard to... It can't just be... The dominance of two parties in the United States cannot simply be explained by the electoral system in and of itself. Because we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, we don't have two parties. But of course, we have a parliamentary model. So I think it must have a great deal to do with the power of the presidency. Only one person can win the presidency. And presidential models do tend to kind of aggregate politics in this way, although it doesn't happen in France, right? So the relationship between the electoral system and two-party dominance is a really complicated one. But the fact of it is hugely important to everything we're talking about the nature of polarization. The parties themselves, as I was mentioning earlier, as kind of institutions, are really not that powerful. But the fact that parties are there as symbols, which have now come to structure the identity of vast numbers, the majority of the American electorate, people see themselves in ways that align with one party or another, and that is a way that structures their understanding of their own gender and their family, and as well as their views on fiscal policy and on cultural issues, is the most foundational fact that underlies everything we're talking about.
And people do sometimes say it's been those two parties, though they've changed their guise in all sorts of ways, but it's been those two parties forever, Republicans, Democrats. Why can't a new party come along? When is some other force going to emerge to rival those two parties? It is worth remembering the last time it happened was when the Republican Party emerged, and the thing that led to was the Civil War.
American political parties, of course, are not like parties in a parliamentary system like the UK. They're not private organisations in the same way, and they're structured into law. Their primary elections are run by the states. So there are incredibly high barriers to a third party entering. It's not just you can have a situation where, like, Ross Perot, who ran in 92 and 96, who sort of as a one-man band can get onto the ballot and conceivably with the wind behind them do very well in a presidential election. And maybe you could have a situation where someone like that would do what Macron did in France and sort of win an election, as it were, from nowhere. But even if that happened, that's not the same as creating a new political party. It's a very, very difficult institutional environment for us when new entrants. And that's why what happens in the United States is that the parties just become vehicles that are taken over by insurgent movements, just like the Trump movement took over the Republican Party.
The war in Iraq, it was called the Iraq War. The war in Russia-Ukraine, it's called the Ukraine War. That's how the media presents it. My question is, the war in Iran that's going now, it's not called the Iran War, but the media presents it as the President's War. Why do you believe that's such?
It's a very good question. I think the only honest answer is it is very, very early in this war. And the range of scenarios is so wide where it might go in a month's time. It could be declared over tomorrow. Trump could announce mission accomplished, and Iranian resistance could continue. And so he might say the war is over, and it turns out it's not over. On the other hand, it could drag on for months. It could spread. Some event may happen, which is the thing that defines the war. I think the reason it is called the present war for now is because it is so unclear for now where this war is going. It will get a name. It may be called Trump's war. And he would probably quite like that, I imagine, which in itself makes him an unusual president. They want to have things named after them, but not on the whole wars. But I think it would be easier to answer that question even in a month's time. And I genuinely don't know. It's quite rare to be living through something. It's really momentous, this war. The lawlessness of it is momentous. But it sort of forks in 5 or 6 possible directions. In a month's time, it might have a name, and it might be a name that we don't associate with it now. It might be known as the war before the Taiwan War.
It's a terrifically clever question. I mean, I think you've put your finger on something really important about naming. There was a war name. I mean, Mr. Polk's War was a successful
I wouldn't want to take an exam question on Mr. Polk's War.
United States invasion of Mexico, which, maybe, I mean, I'm sure Trump knows nothing about the US invasion of Mexico in the 1840s, but it was.
But don't tell him about it because it might give him ideas. We have a bonus episode coming out tomorrow on PPF Plus. So if you would like to hear it, you know what to do. Click on the link in our show description, go to ppfideas.com. This episode is a version of another talk that I gave recently, but this one wasn't recorded live, so I've done it again. It's about the British general election of 1945 and the myths around that election that persist to this day and I think confuse British politics. What really happened? How did Labour win? And why won't lightning strike twice? Here's a clip. But the other thing about that version of history is that the story I've been telling just now about 1945, the template story, the model, the inspiration, the consolation, doesn't stack up. It isn't true that that's what happened in 1945. It's a myth. Like all myths, it has elements of truth in it. It's not a complete fantasy. But the real story of 1945, I think, is different. And understanding the ways in which it's different helps explain why lightning won't strike twice, but also, I think, suggests different kinds of lessons for politics, for Labour politics, for electoral politics more generally, for thinking about what can and can't be learnt from an election like this one. It is one of the most remarkable elections in British political history. The result remains astonishing to this day. There are certainly things to be learned from it. But that idea that an overmatched, underdog Labour Party scrappily offered the British public something bold and radical, and the British public, hungry for change, lapped it up, put Clement Attlee in Downing Street, and then allowed him to deliver. That story doesn't stack up. So I want to talk about what I think really happened in 1945, or to put it slightly differently, why the lessons aren't the ones in that mythic version. To get that episode, to get all of our bonus episodes, ad-free listening, free sign up to our newsletter, and crucially, never have to hear me asking you to sign up again, click on the link, go to our website. It costs £5 a month or £50 for a year to subscribe to PPF Plus. There are very nearly 50 bonus episodes waiting for you there, and we enormously value the support that it gives us. Next time in our regular slot, we're starting a new series. I'm going to be talking to the political historian David Klemperer about what we're calling political conversions, stories from the last 100 years of people who have changed party, ideology, identity, turned themselves inside out, switched sides, crossed the line, from socialist to fascist, from Trotskyite to neoconservative, becoming communists, losing the faith. What causes people to undergo conversions of that kind? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.